We have about 3/4 of an hour, which is a lot of time, so everybody who wants to ask a question or make a comment can do so. I want to confess that the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War is not a multi-thousand-dollar enterprise. I'm the treasurer, and I know. And so we are going to. I'm going to ask Derek if he wouldn't mind going to the back and getting the cookie tin, and we'll pass it around. We don't want to take all your money in this collection, because we know you have to pay to get your car out of the parking lot or put money into the fare box on the bus. And we also want you to put aside some money in your pocket to buy one of Yves' books that are on the back table there. So they were about $10 and $20? Yeah,
the prices are, I sell them sliding scale, so lower income students can pay less, but the prices are low.
So we want to make sure everybody has enough money in their pocket to buy one of his books, or to buy Mark's book on our table, the Voices from Syria, which is $5, and the money is very courteously donated by Mark. The books have been donated by Mark. So if you wouldn't mind going around, Derek, where is he?
Oh, got it already. Got it going.
Pardon me?
Got it going.
Okay, I think you should stick with it, okay? Thank you. And now, as to the question period, we have normal rules that we use every time. For the rules of the question period, we ask you to raise your hand. We ask you to limit your remarks to 2.5 minutes. I have a watch, and I'm going to give a 30-second warning. You may make a comment if you don't want to ask a question. We'd ask that there's no back and forth with Yves, because we want everyone to have a chance. If there aren't many questions, we'll give people a second opportunity to ask a question. And we always say that we want respectful discussion only. I don't think it's really necessary for me to say it to this group, but we say it anyway, that we will not tolerate any racist, sexist, or homophobic comments. So let's go ahead and take some questions. I did want to mention one other thing, and that is that one thing that Yves didn't cover, he did cover the NDP, but he's got a new book on the back burner he's working on, he told us earlier today, about the other institutions in the so-called left in this country, like the Rideau Institute, like the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, like Ceasefire, and a few other groups that consider themselves to be left-wing organizations. And he is about to put together this book that shows that even on the so-called left, there's really no opposition to Canadian foreign policy as it is now. That's basically going along with foreign policy, with the existing Canadian foreign policy, with just a little bit of a 10% change or shift over. He can elaborate if you wish. So, are there any questions that people would like to ask? Yes?
I'd like to know that you wrote a book about the Harper foreign policy, and then you talked a lot tonight about what's happened in the last 2 years with Trudeau as Prime Minister. Could you make some comments about what the Liberals did with respect to foreign policy, while the Conservatives, such as Harper, was in power?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the spectrum of debate is pretty limited on many big issues. There are some areas where they did criticize in a way that I support. So,
excuse me, could you use the mic?
Oh, sure. So the Liberals in opposition, obviously more willing to be critical than in government. Something like Iran, they criticized the breaking diplomatic relations with Iran back in 2012. Something like the mining would be a clear example where they said they believed in bringing in restrictions on Canadian mining companies found to be responsible for significant abuses abroad. But yeah, in opposition, I mean, Libya, something where every every politician in the House of Commons, with the exception of Elizabeth May, on one of 2 occasions, voted to support the war in Libya. So they were on board for that. In Afghanistan, it was kind of complicated. At some points, the Liberals sort of took a critical position vis-a-vis Harper, but it was to a large extent Liberals that started the whole, that the Harper just ramped up. So yeah, I mean, the point, I guess, or the underlying point of this talk and the underlying point of this book that I've just finished is that the range of debate on these questions is very narrow in this country, and that range of debate is very narrow in the dominant media and very narrow in the official political realm. And even you see in the case of the NDP or the Greens, they don't want to push very far on these things. So take something like the boycott, divestment, sanctions towards Israel campaign. The Green Party. This is the Green Party with 1 MP in the House of Commons. The members all vote for that a year ago. Right? They at their biannual, I think it was, meeting in Ottawa. They I forget the numbers. More than 2/3 in the pre-poll leading up to the convention supported at the convention, and basically Elizabeth May does everything she can to kibosh it to the point where they organize a new special general meeting for 4 months later. They just had a biannual general meeting, which supports this policy, and then the party leadership, you spend a lot of their money to organize a whole new one. Fortunately, members organized and actually forced the party to basically confirm what had been adopted. But my point in saying that is that basically Elizabeth May on that issue, where the members and clearly thousands, tens of thousands of Canadians are supportive of, basically views that if she was to get behind that policy, that would just put her outside of the mainstream discussion in this country. That would make her or her party viewed as a joke when it came to like official discussion. So Palestine is one issue, and there's some particulars around that issue. But the broader policy this is the same, where it's a very narrow range of debate. And so when the Liberals are in opposition, even when they're in their critical mode, they don't criticize that much. And then when they get into government, they do even less in terms of any of the positive criticisms they were making basically get dropped, and they just continue the policy as such.
Yeah, I just wanted to, Henry Evans Tenbrink from Hamilton, just wanted to mention that I think it's important to mention also that the Labour movement in Canada is also complicit in not speaking out against foreign policy. And until recently, you use Palestine as an example. Until recently, Unifor and CUPE, which are major unions, have spoken in favor of BDS and supporting Palestine. But up until then, and even today, there's still quite a divide within Labour regarding foreign policy. For example, with the light armoured vehicles going to Saudi Arabia, there are factions within Labour that support it because it affects the jobs for their members. So
Yeah, in the book I've completed. That's actually, I have a major chapter about the NDP, and a major chapter of Union NDP CCF foreign policy history, and then Union's foreign policy history. And I mean, the Labour's foreign policy is interesting actually, because Labour foreign policy is probably the most clear positive that we've seen if you take the last 50, 60 years.
Yeah.
So after World War II, Labour's foreign policy, Union's foreign policy is like atrocious beyond belief. They were the Cold War, support for NATO, support for Korean War. Unions today have now, they don't do much on the issue, but if you look, most of the statements that come out from unions on foreign policy issues mostly are going in what I would consider the right direction. you know, they're not critical of Canada's role usually. There's, you know, there's many issues I would take you know, challenge, but the broad kind of outline is in the kind of positive direction. But that was not the case. So, you know,
That's why I said until recently.
yeah, and no, Palestine's a stark example, where in the case of UNIFOR and CAW, in 2006, CAW president, previous CAW president, Buzz Hargrove, he went to Israel with Heather Reisman and
Yep.
Jerry Schwartz, right? Two of the biggest pro-Zionists. They organized the Hesek Foundation to pay for non-Israelis to go fight in the Israeli military, right? This is like extreme Zionist kind of whatever. He goes to Israel with them, and Hargrove had done all kinds of stuff to undermine Palestinian solidarity among other unions. And now, 10 years later after Hargrove, the UNIFOR has just passed a resolution in favor of partial BDS. So that's actually a really stark example of a change pretty quickly. But yeah, within the labor movement, it's mostly, you know, the point of this book that I'm not going to be talking more about this book, but the point of part of the point that I'm making in this book is that on domestic issues there is somewhat of a countervailing force, right? The labor movement does, you know, obviously corporate Canada has much more money than the labor movement does, but the labor movement does have, you know, it is an institutional structure with thousands of employees across the country. It's able to sort of put a bit of check on corporate power on domestic issues. On foreign policy issues, basically corporate Canada and Global Affairs Canada are left to their own to do whatever the hell they want, and there is no countervailing kind of force. And so you know what we want, I think one of the things we want of people who are in unions, who are active within their unions, is to do what they can to bring these issues up. And there's often lots of good people who are open. There's for many different reasons, structural reasons, whatnot, ideological reasons, that those issues get, you know, put aside. There's the issues that are pressing to members, and you know, understandably in one sense, and not understandably in another sense. But labor should definitely be viewed as a battleground for a more just Canadian foreign policy.
I think Jean-Luc was first.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier about that, what should have been, that's extremely long-winded thing about nuclear disarmament. They should just call it SALT 3. But the point being that it's especially hypocritical for Canada to vote against nuclear disarmament when we don't supposedly have any nuclear weapons to begin with. And yet, as far as I know, Canada has the world's largest natural uranium deposits. So like, if anybody actually wanted to make nuclear weapons, a large amount of them, and like, for example, the United States right next door, you know, come to Canada, we've got all the uranium, like, something like 80% of the world's total, I think.
Well, and of course, those bombs that were dropped on Japan, that was
Yeah.
uranium from Canada, that was part of those bombs. And
Made in Canada.
And Iraq.
And Iraq, yeah.
Completed.
Yeah, so, you know, there's clearly Canada's alliance with NATO and Washington is more important than the danger of nuclear weapons to humanity's survival, from the standpoint of the decision makers in Ottawa.
Why don't you mention that Canada's vote at the United Nations on the new treaty to ban nuclear weapons?
Yeah, no, Canada
He did mention that.
against, vote against. So there was, I think.
Barbara was next
Yeah,
here.
Barbara.
Could you speak a little bit more on ceasefire and say what what you're finding out in your research there?
Well, so Rideau Institute and ceasefire, which are basically kind of one and the same. Well, I don't want to be, there's lots of, I support lots of petitions that Rideau Institute and ceasefire put out. I signed lots of stuff. There's lots of good stuff that's being done. I don't want to just dump on those groups. But the reality is that Rideau Institute is headed up by Peggy Mason. Well, Peggy Mason was Joe Clark, former Conservative foreign minister. She was a top advisor for Joe Clark. She's been in Canadian diplomatic circles for 30 years. A couple of years ago in the House of Commons, she talks about how she trains NATO forces in UN peacekeeping. I think she might, according to her LinkedIn profile, she might still be doing that. So here you have the head of what's supposed to be the main left-wing foreign policy institute in this country openly saying she trains NATO forces. I mean,
Seems a bit of a conflict of interest.
I mean, you just can't imagine that that's going to be somebody who's going to push the ball in the direction that we need to go. Okay, well, who's one of the main people they work with for their reports? Walter Dorn. People familiar with Walter Dorn? Well, so Walter Dorn's written a number of reports. Walter Dorn for Rideau Institute. Walter Dorn is a prof at the Royal Military College in Kingston. So the Royal Military College being the one university that's federal government university run by the military. So he's an employee of the military. Now Walter Dorn basically represents the liberal end of the military discussion. He is somebody who says that we need more peacekeeping. Now, Walter Dorn worked with MINUSTA, the UN mission in Haiti, the UN mission that was going into the slum neighborhoods and killing people, the UN mission that was part of the 2004 coup that Canada, the US, and France overthrew elected government, and then we have the UN occupation, which just sort of basically ended a couple weeks ago, a week ago. And he's somebody who was an employee. He was for the UN mission in Haiti. This is. You can read in Walter Dorn's stuff about Canada's role in the Congo, the UN mission in the Congo in the early 1960s. He applauds. That's a UN mission that was involved in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the independence leader in the Congo. So Walter Dorn, yes, I prefer Walter Dorn's position on the world to Jack Granatstein. Yes. Does that make Walter Dorn's position even close to what we need, or something that left-wing Foreign Policy Institute should be promoting? No. And basically, you have to, whenever the peacekeeping discussion, institutionally, the Canadian military, there has been a debate in the Canadian military. It's now, that debate has to a large extent been decided in favor of the pro-NATO types. But historically, the Canadian military, for institutional reasons, has supported peacekeeping for their budget, because the population likes the idea of peacekeeping. And so the military, as a way to justify military spending, has tried to emphasize peacekeeping, that's much of what they do is peacekeeping, even though all along it's been NATO has been 90% of what they actually do. They have been into promoting the idea of peacekeeping. Now, Walter Dorn comes into that discussion as, like if you find, Walter Dorn doesn't call for less military, doesn't call for, he really doesn't make any, from what I can tell, doesn't make any criticism of Canadian foreign policy except to say we need more peacekeeping. That's his only, and I've read a fair bit of Walter Dorn stuff. So that's kind of like where the Rideau Institute is at, and I understand why they do it. They do it because Walter Dorn gets picked up in the media, in the corporate media. So if you're going to do, if you're a think tank that's producing reports, part of your point of doing that is to be picked up in the media. When the CCPA does a report on the minimum wage, half of, or 75% of what they're trying to do with that report is to get a bunch of news stories about, how we should increase the minimum wage, or whatever the argument they're making. The problem is on the foreign policy realm that the corporate media debate is so narrow that the Rideau Institute, if you're trying to get corporate media coverage, it makes sense to work with Walter Dorn to produce your reports. If you're trying to put forward a just Canadian foreign policy, that's a different story. And is the realm of doing that to go through the corporate media? Personally, I don't think that would be the way I would structure a foreign policy institute. Something that I'm involved in doing. It's going to be Canadian Foreign Policy Institute will be set up very soon as an online thing. So yeah, that's another way of saying that there's lots of good stuff that Rideau Institute does, but there's some major limitations. And I think people who are donors and members should bring the question up. I brought the question up to Stephen Staples and Peggy Mason, and I know that there's been Ken's been involved in some back and forth on some of these issues. These things can be brought up in ways that are not just divisive. They can be brought up in ways that are like, hey, we take this stuff seriously. We have to take this stuff seriously. And like I said, I go out of my way to vote, to sign lots of Veto Institute petitions and to support, post their stuff and when I support it, but simultaneously be critical of the limitations. So. I think Mark had a question.
No, there was first a question from Tom.
Yeah, I'm Tom Baker. Really excited about your new book. I think it's long overdue that we have a thorough discussion amongst the broad left, progressive organizations, or those that claim to be, on the whole issue of imperialism. There's so much confusion. Left journals, including so-called Marxist journals that I followed over the years, seem to have forgotten what imperialism is, and they start labeling Russia as imperialism, and it's all garbled, people, So I think it's high time for that discussion, and look forward to your book. One thing I wanted to ask you about was institutionalize, the importance of building institutions. I found that rather fascinating, because I'm a member of Socialist Caucus, right, inside the NDP, and one of the things we fought for during the leadership campaign was for, we gave critical support to Nikki, but we were hoping she would speak out on NATO and some of these. She did say one or two good things, but nothing about the substantive pro-imperialist foreign policy of the NDP. I'm not sure all the reasons why she didn't, but there was a lot of us here and across the country that were strongly encouraging her to do so. So there is a federal convention, by the way, of the NDP coming up in February in Ottawa, and I think it would be really useful for us to go to our local riding associations, join the NDP if you haven't, and fight for some decent resolutions that could potentially win at Ottawa. I don't think that's to be excluded. The Socialist Caucus, has generally gets about 20% base level on resolutions and so on that it puts forward, and on some we win occasionally. So I think now is the time. I like that idea of institutionalizing something that can be more permanent.
From the late 60s to the late 80s, the NDP had an official position of pulling out of NATO. And I don't know whatever happened to the official position. I don't think it actually was ever formally revoked, but it's just sort of been kind of put aside by new statements and whatever. And the way that was won, I wasn't. Maybe I was alive. No, I wasn't alive when it initially won, but or was maintained from it. It was basically people pushing it for years and years and years, and it was debated for years at the NDP, and it took literally decades to shift that policy, and to shift it back to a Canada out of NATO position, which is an eminently reasonable position for a social democratic third party in the position of the NDP. Is not to mention morally, it's obviously morally very strong position, but it's just work. It's about pushing it at different forums. And I, like I said, brought this stuff up about Palestine. To my mind, the only thing I engaged a fair bit with the NDP forum or the NDP leadership race to try to prod foreign policy issues into the discussion. The only reason why Palestine got debated and tweeted, and even Jagmeet Singh has the feeling like he needs to put out a bunch of tweets after it comes out that he went on a Center for Israel Jewish Affairs trip to Israel. So then he started putting out a bunch of pro-Palestinian tweets, and he'd done some pro-Palestine stuff before that. And it's part of why he went on the CJ trip was to play both sides. It's because it's being pushed. Right, and if it's not pushed, if NATO's not pushed, Canada and NATO's not pushed in NDP, why would, if I'm a politician, why would I? I mean, just to put it really, you're trying to win as the politician. This is not just a, sort of a moral thing. The morality comes from the activists. The morality comes from those of us who don't have some personal stake in, a job with whatever or winning this, riding or whatever. That's what activism, that we're in a position where we can put forward what's morally correct, not what's acceptable to, the party hierarchy, what's acceptable to the dominant media, and that's what those of us who want to shift those debates need to be engaged in.
Mark was next. And
This ties in a little bit with what Tom was saying. Right now, the narrative is telling us lies. The foreign policy narrative is equals lies, as you've indicated, and I've indicated that in my book as well. Ken recently wrote an article about Vanna Alabed, who actually, and J.K. Rowling wrote a book about it, and she's selling all sorts of books, I would imagine. And this is part of the problem. The predominant narrative is being governed by lies. Her Vanna Alabed's parents are aligned with terrorists. And yet, the messaging is that while we support, well, the reality is we do support the terrorists in Syria. But the messaging is confusing people on purpose. So what can a group like this do to expand the readership of evidence-based work, such as yours, for example, or mine? What could a group like this do to get more of our books into school libraries, into public libraries, into the public sphere? What would you suggest?
You might explain who Vanna Alabed is.
Well, you're better place. I read your piece, but you're better place too.
Vanna Alabed is a spectacular example of child exploitation. She is an 8-year-old girl from Aleppo, Syria, who was alleged to have written a number of tweets from occupied Aleppo. That's the eastern part of Aleppo, which the terrorists occupied in 2012 or 2013, I think it was. And during the Syrian army's liberation of Aleppo, she was the poster child for a campaign called #StandWithAleppo. And she allegedly, in English, sent out tweets that almost every day, many times a day, criticizing the Syrian government for alleged atrocities and the Russian government for alleged atrocities concerning the liberation of Aleppo. But as it turns out, Vanna Alabed's family lived in an apartment complex in eastern Aleppo. And her father was a Sharia judge for al-Nusra, which is the al-Qaeda group in Syria. That meant that he got to decide who lived, who was jailed in the basement of the complex in which Vanna lived, and who was tortured there, and who was killed. And in that complex was also the headquarters of al-Nusra in that part of Aleppo. So Vanna Alabed's parents are, embedded in al-Nusra. And the lies that were being propagated by Vanna Alabed were that the Syrian government was committing atrocities. But as it turned out, the liberation of eastern Aleppo turned out to be very professional and very humane. The Syrian army opened up civilian corridors every couple of days so that civilians could escape from the clutch of the terrorists in eastern Aleppo, and thousands of them did escape from eastern Aleppo, though the terrorists were firing on them as they escaped. And the Russian government brought in truckloads every day, tractor-trailer truckloads of food every day into eastern Aleppo. And the Syrian army did not carpet bomb eastern Aleppo. They could have, with the help of the Russian Air Force. Instead, they liberated eastern Aleppo house by house and street by street, so that today, 9 months after the liberation of Aleppo, eastern Aleppo, 600,000 Syrian refugees have returned and are living in eastern Aleppo. Now compare that to the situation of Raqqa, which was liberated a couple of days ago by the US-led coalition. The US-led coalition carpet-bombed Raqqa, and now, you might have seen it on the CBC last night. I think they did a 10-minute, I watched it. It was last night or the night before, and it's a ghost town. 80% of the buildings have been destroyed and are uninhabitable. Nobody has come back. No citizens of Raqqa have returned to Raqqa because there's no water, there's no hydro, there's no sewers, there's nothing. But in eastern Aleppo, 600,000 people live there now. And so during the siege, the liberation of eastern Aleppo, Bana is tweeting. One of the tweets, the most famous tweet she tweeted, was that she wouldn't mind to see the Western world take on Russia over eastern Aleppo, even if it meant a third world war, because the Syrian army was committing such atrocities. Well, there weren't any atrocities. And furthermore, when we had Eva Bartlett here in January, Eva Bartlett was there during the liberation of eastern Aleppo. She's a freelance journalist from Fergus, Ontario. And she said she could not get internet. She could not send any tweets. She could not get on Facebook in Aleppo because it wasn't available. So Bana Alabed was tweeting away left and right every day. And then in the CBC's The Current with Anna Maria Tremonti had a little program about Bana a few days ago. I wrote an article about it. And in the documentary, which is 23 minutes long, Bana says, she admits that she left eastern Aleppo on the buses that were provided by the Syrian government for the evacuation of the 10,000 terrorists, Al-Nusra, that's Al-Qaeda terrorists with their families and their small arms. They all got on buses provided by the Syrian government, and they were shipped off to the neighboring province of Idlib. And Bana was on those buses. So she was with the terrorists. And furthermore, a few days later, she ended up in Ankara, Turkey. And whose lap did she end up sitting in for photo ops? You guessed it, President Erdogan, who is one of the chief architects of the regime change operation in Syria and one of the chief profiteers of the oil that was stolen from Syria. His brother-in-law got all that oil. So I think this tells you something about Bana Alabed. It's not quite what it appears to be. And I think Mark's point is well taken. How do we get more people to read these things?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the way it's activism is the way you get people to. I mean, technologically, it's never been easier, right, to disseminate information, and particularly international affairs. So the question is that these are issues that are removed from people's lives, and so what's going to make people take the time to engage in something that's so removed from their life? And it's by creating points of tension on some of these issues and putting it in front of their faces, and by having demonstrations, having rallies, offering. I'm of the opinion that some of this comes down to just a simple number of times you see something. The average person sees an ad, like something like they say about 3,000 advertisements in a day. How many left-wing political messages does an average person see in a day? It certainly ain't 3,000. I don't know what, is it one? Is it half of one? Is it? So at some level, it's as simple as like, well, people are hearing 3,000 messages that life is better if you buy whatever, and then they're hearing, one message saying that pay attention to the world, and we could live in a more ecologically and equitable world if we took a bit of time to work for that. So yeah, there's no easy answer. I mean, like the life, there's institutions. We don't live in a totalitarian system, right? Like, we're allowed to have these meetings and openly kind of say whatever we kind of want about the Canadian government. That's somewhat unique, and it should be expanded and taken advantage of. The library system in this country, I'm sure there's biases, but my experience is that public libraries, if you ask them to order a book, they usually order it. So we have, there are, you know, like labor unions. There are locals that, you know, maybe foreign policy is not really something that it's not high on their agenda, but they're not opposed to it if it's, you know, brought forward. There's lots of sort of institutions, lots of political spaces in this country that are not being maximized. I was always one about, like, so we go on, you know, the corporate media in this country and all the power. Well, yeah, how many student newspapers are there in this country who are just sort of desperate for content? There's, you know, dozens of student newspapers across the country that, like, if 40 students across the country take the time to write for those papers, they're pretty much willing to take whatever people engage to write. There's like that, how many people are reached by those student newspapers across the country? Maybe 50, 100, couple 100,000 people. Maximizing all these spaces that already exist. And, you know, I think we do need to create new institutions, and we do need to, but there's lots of spaces that are not being close to maximized, you know, like right now. So that's.
Yeah, if I could just, one final comment, I agree, we should be asking that these books get into the public record, into the public library, and so on. But I would say we're basically inverted totalitarianism, because the lie has become the truth. And Bana Alabet is an example of that.
Thank you.
Or we're close.
This brother here, and then Ramsey, and then Gail. That'll probably finish the question period.
Did you do some investigative work on issues, African issues, in the past?
Well, I wrote a book called Canada and Africa, 300 Years of Hate and Exploitation.
It's on the back table?
So, yeah.
Do you have a blog?
I post my articles on just yvesengler.com. There's dozens and dozens of articles, many of them different elements of
It's on Facebook
of Africa,
as well?
of Africa related, yeah. Facebook stuff.
Did you cover Rwanda?
Yeah, I've covered stuff with Rwanda. Is there something in specific about Rwanda? The Rwanda story there's lots to tell about Rwanda that can go on for a long time.
I thought I recall reading some of your work on Rwanda, which I thought was quite exceptional.
Yeah, no, I mean, I mentioned the stuff about Paul Kagame, that how far down the deference for the dictatorship there is in our political culture, that even when somebody wins 98.63% of the votes, our High Commissioner decides to tweet out congratulations for what's clearly a joke, right? But
Well, there are two women in jail in Rwanda, Victoire Ingabire and Diane Rwigama, who dared to run against Paul Kagame, and they're sitting in jail right now.
And yeah, and I mean, and what's important about Diane is that she comes from the full-on top of the Tutsi elite, close to Kagame circles, right? This is not somebody. This is not a poor farmer. This is one of the wealthiest families in the country. The regime killed her father. He died in a car crash in questionable circumstances when he went away politically, and then she's come out. So it's an incredibly repressive regime, and it's been responsible for, like I mentioned, there's no politician on the African continent that has more responsibility for African deaths than Paul Kagame.
Is he working for our mining companies?
Well, he's clearly been aligned with U.S., Canadian, British geopolitics in the Congo. That's been a big part of the story. Is the Congo is a source of just insane amounts of mineral wealth, right? Hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. Some estimates going to, I think, in the trillions. And Kagame has been a pro-Washington, London, Ottawa power source in the Congo since at least '96.
Did you say we had 50% of the mining companies here?
Well, some estimates have said as high as 75%, but between 50 and 75% of the world's mining companies are listed or based in Canada, listed on Canadian Stock Exchange or based in this country. Generally, the biggest, not the biggest, Canada just overwhelming dominates the so-called juniors, the smaller companies that prospect and then often bought up by the bigger companies when the extraction process gets going. But the Toronto Stock Exchange, the Globe and Mail had a story a couple of days ago in the business section about just how much there's been a sort of boom in mining and how much business that is for lawyers in Toronto. Right? So when mining gets going around the world, the Toronto law firms are doing really well. The Canadian banks are top players in paying attention to resources around the world.
TD Bank is one of the biggest.
Yeah. So Canadian capital, Canadian business. It's not just the mining companies per se. It spills into the law sector. It spills into I think some engineering elements, banking world. Canadians have banks set up in Peru with the explicit objective of facilitating mining extraction. So it's a highly, the biggest mining conference in the world, the Prospective Developers Association of Canada meeting takes place in Toronto every year, where it brings thousands and thousands of people from around the world in the mining sector. That's the world's mining industry to a large extent. Toronto is what is shaping things, and Canadian politicians. In terms of in the book about Africa, you start looking at different African mineral legislations and the influence of Canadian aid money, rewriting countries' mining codes, prospecting countries, so figuring out where the resources are, so then companies can come in, paying from different geological schools. So huge amounts of Canadian aid, into the hundreds of millions of dollars of Canadian aid, has gone to facilitating a mining extraction. And it's not a coincidence that Canadian mining companies tend to dominate that sector. Yeah.
So it's like Burma, where they just move people aside and mine?
And there's example after example where they do that, where the rural people, or the poor people, or indigenous people who live where those mining companies need to get, well, you are no longer needed.
Okay, we have Ramsey and then Gail.
I think the same pressure groups, the corporate elite, can put pressure on the government, whether it's liberal or conservative. They have the same interest. I mean, I'm not part of, I can't put $1,500 to go and have fish and chips at the Ritz-Carlton. But anyway, that's the same people put pressure on both governments. I think that we're duped into thinking that, oh yeah, we have the liberals and then we have the conservatives. I've seen, over the past 50 years that I lived in Canada, I've seen some idiots get onto the helm of the government, whether both conservative or liberal. And I was told that even Elizabeth May, who doesn't know anything to the corporate elite, I don't think, was told to watch her mouth. And that's why she's going against the grain right now within the Green Party, I think. I'm not too sure, but I think that's what it is. Then we have the problem of the unions. The unions in this country don't teach the membership anything. They just pay the dues and they have their own elections and a few people get in there and all that. But there's no education. I remember one of the candidates, the NDP candidates, who was standing at the gate at Stelco. He mentioned in a conversation that he saw the workers come in, and there were so many newspapers, there's the Toronto Star, the Hamilton Spectator, the Globe and Mail, but they all went for the Sun. Very, very few of them took, you know, the other newspapers. That's what I'm saying. There's no education to the membership so that they can put the pressure on the government or the, you know, during the elections, elect some have decent people rather than whatever. But anyway, I don't want to belabor the point. Canadians in general, when I came to this country and I went to university, and we were discussing something, you know, in political science or in economics or whatever, and everybody was saying, oh, Canada and United States can do this, Canada and United States can do that. And me being a foreigner, I say, yeah, Canada and what do you call one of these, Micronesia can do this, and Canada, and I mean, America, United States and Micronesia can do this. Why are you saying that why do you put yourself with the Americans? You know, many people in Canada think of themselves as Americans. They even think like Americans, and I don't, you know, I'm against that. I mean, I'm not American. I don't want to be part of it. Look at the idiot they have over there. You want to be there? This is what I'm, you know, what I observe. You can...
Yeah, well, just two points on some of what you said. One thing is that, yes, the fundraisers, the corporate fundraisers with the politicians have an impact, but that's a small part of the whole. And, you know, it's the setting up of the think tanks. It's the setting up of different lobby groups. It's the influence within the media. So when you talk about someone like Elizabeth May, and all politicians, and all of us, for that matter, we're not removed from the institutions of idea formation and propaganda in this society. We're all, you know, sort of operating in a certain political culture, and the corporate elite's power over that discussion, and the state's power over that discussion, or the foreign policy establishment's power over that discussion, is multifaceted in how it operates, which I detail in the propaganda system book. In terms of the passivity of labor with membership, well, a big chunk of what Canadian unions have got going on foreign policy realm is humanities funds, and that is basically you fundraise. You basically a charity. It's just develop a charity arm so members put a penny an hour. In principle, it has a sort of nice sounding component to it. You put a small each hour of work. You put a penny in. You bargain to have the employer put a penny in for each hour of work, or a couple pennies, or whatever, and they can actually, you know, raise a lot of money. Some of these humanities funds have multiple millions of dollars of annual funding, but it's all structured around being a charity. So to me, what a big part of what Labor's foreign policy should be about is precisely what you're saying, which is about a working class view of international affairs. If we're to try to take a working class view of Canada's role in the world, what would that be? And how do we disseminate that idea, first of all, internally within our institution, within our members, and then, you know, externally as well. But the humanities funds are basically, so if you raise this, you know, millions of dollars, you could do that. You could be bringing up people who were victimized by Canadian mining companies. You could be bringing up, you know, like the government in Honduras in 2009 that said that Canada was giving oxygen to the coup forces, the military coup forces. You could be bringing up them to, you know, educate members. You have millions of dollars, unlike Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, which doesn't have that kind of resources, as part of educational processes. But the model has been the charity model. We should just give money to some project in Haiti. We don't talk about how Canada has contributed to impoverishment in Haiti. We just go and give some couple $100,000 to something that's, in and of itself, probably a good thing. If you look at it totally narrowly, it's helping a small number of people's lives. If you step back and look at the big picture of how that fits into broader questions of inequality in the world, power relationships, maybe not such a good thing, which is the case with most aid. So yeah, I think that on the foreign policy realm, and particularly around humanities funds, that's a perfect example of unions not mobilizing their membership on these issues, and that would be the most important thing of a labor revival on foreign policy. The most important thing would definitely be about trying to talk about these issues internally and develop a critical pro-working class perspective on international affairs, which is just not on the agenda almost at all.
Okay, last question would be from Gail.
Could you briefly comment on the columnist writer Gwyn Dyer?
Yeah, I mean, Gwyn Dyer, I read some of Gwyn Dyer. Gwyn Dyer was somebody who was, in his book he published a couple of years ago, I read it for the propaganda system. He was somebody who was like at the sort of critical edge of the military discussion. I don't find that he talks about Canada much. Like I find some of his, I read a piece about that he wrote 4 or 5 months ago, whatever, about the partition of India. Did it need to happen? Which I found, kind of interesting perspective. Not an issue I know much about. So I read some of his stuff I find kind of interesting. Most of it doesn't really have much to do with Canada. It's just sort of, he is Canadian, or I believe he's Canadian, his sort of perspective on international affairs, but not like what's Canada involvement, which I don't find all that politically helpful if there isn't the bringing our institutions, our government's kind of involvement into it. But yeah, he represents I know he had big fights with the Asper media at one point, refused to stop publishing him and stuff like that. So he was viewed as somebody a little bit on the sort of critical edge of the dominant discussion. But yeah, in his book he tells a story about the military. I can't remember the details right now. About I think he might have worked for the military back in the 80s on some stuff and how sort of breaking away from it. And he argued against all of these alliances. So like basically Canada's role in NATO, Canada's role in NORAD, and he kind of made arguments like sort of from the perspective of Canadian nationalism, Canadian sort of somewhat military perspective against that, which got him completely ostracized in that world, which I think are useful kind of arguments. But.
Well, thank you very much, Yves. There is one announcement that Fred would like to make about a situation going on right now about freedom of information in this country. Can you make it briefly, do you think, in a couple of minutes?
Sure, absolutely.
Fred is the head of the National Security Oversight Institute.
Yeah, so I don't know if any of you have sort of been following what's going on with Bill C-58. Bill C-58 is a bill. It's being rushed through the House Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics Committee right now. Okay? Tomorrow, in fact, is going to be the very last day of a clause-by-clause consideration of this bill. And it deals with fundamental reform to open government to the extent that the Access to Information Act, which I know our speaker tonight heavily relies on, and many civil society groups, the NDP, many unions rely on, is going to be essentially neutered. And the government didn't really announce their intentions to do this. In fact, they announced during the election that they were going to open up the system. They were going to make the Access to Information Act, more accessible to Canadians. And what they've done is introduce legislation that, get this, the Information Commissioner of Canada, an independent officer of Parliament, okay, who doesn't report to government, has called regressive. So I'm making this announcement tonight because everybody should everybody should understand that once the government shuts down our access to information, the flow of information, I mean, that's probably worse than C-51, because you won't even have access to understand what's going on anymore.
So what could this audience do?
So what I would suggest is, and it's interesting because I see that in Yves' book, Yves has talked about the Afghan detainee matter. And it's very interesting in that at committee, just the other day, and in fact on, I think it was on November the 1st, yes, our NDP, the NDP MP that sits on the Access to Information Privacy and Ethics Committee, basically, he posed a question to the Information Commissioner. He said, this is, and I quote this, okay? This is very important. He said, so a hypothetical situation. He said, I'm in the Department of Defense and someone has made a request about the transfer of detainees in Afghanistan, a pretty sensitive topic. If I were to deem that as vexatious, this is in other words, he's quoting here, this is somebody who is just looking to attack the Canadian military unfairly, put us in the news. With no other definition, could that request have been denied under terms of vexatiousness? And I put that in context. Vexatiousness is a new enactment in this bill, okay, to restrict access. Here's what the Information Commissioner said in reply. She said, based on Bill C-58, yes, it could. And then she went on. He actually asked, she went on to say, even if you were to say all records in relation to Afghan detainees, the MP shot back, that would be too broad and would be denied. And she came back with a point-blank answer, and she said, of course. So that's how bad this bill is. Okay? We wouldn't even know about the Afghan detainee affair. If this bill, Bill C-58, being rushed through committee right now, had been law back during the Harper years, what you can do is call your MP and say, you know, this is absolutely over the line. The government information doesn't belong to the people in Ottawa, it belongs to us. And where in the world do they get off thinking that this is okay? It's not okay. So call your MP and demand that you should not have your access to your own records. They're not the government's records. They're your records. Demand that this bill be taken off the legislative agenda.
Thank you. Thank you for coming tonight, and please help yourself to whatever books are left on the table there.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. You're welcome.